Fantastic. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for our event looking at building a resilient workforce. My name is Emma Kidger. I am the Support and Development Manager here at Clinks, and I chair our member advisory forum. And I'm delighted to be joined by some of our representatives from the member advisory forum who have kind of come together to plan this event this morning. We've got a 2-hour event that's going to be running, and we're going to be focusing on well-being, recruitment challenges, building resilience within the team, and thinking about sort of how we're going to be able to share best practice, learn from examples and practice that's happened in the past, and ultimately try and sort of work together to ensure that there is an emphasis on prioritising well-being within the workforce. That's what we're here to do today. And we're very much going to be looking at very different aspects of that, sharing some research and some evidence, hearing some stories and some journeys that have been going on for one of our member advisory forum members, looking at innovative ways to address and to prioritise wellbeing within the workforce. As it's kind of been a focus for us within the member advisory forum over the last year, bearing in mind that we hear from so many of our sector members around how much of an issue sort of recruitment and retention and maintaining a skilled workforce is, and knowing that ultimately within the voluntary sector, thinking about salary uplifts and pay increases being an option that just isn't there for many organisations. So we want to spend a bit of time today thinking about alternative ways that we can try and ensure that staff feel valued, and that we can focus on wellbeing and that everybody understands the importance of that. So that's what we aim to do today. We're going to, as I said, we've got a 2-hour session. I'm delighted to be joined, like I said, from some of our advisory forum members. I will introduce them properly when it gets to their segments on the agenda, and everybody is going to have an opportunity to speak. And then we will be going into a sort of networking session for the last 20 to 30 minutes of the event to sort of talk further about some of the discussion points from today, share some more best practice in some smaller groups, and that will be how we end the event today. In terms of sort of housekeeping and logistics of the event, feel free to use the chat function as much as possible. At the end of each sort of speaking segment, there will be an opportunity for questions. So we'll make sure that you have the opportunity to ask all of the speakers any questions that you've got. But if you would like to ask questions throughout the chat, then please feel free to do so. And we'll keep an eye on that and make sure that we get back to you on those questions. If we do run out of time in each segment, we'll be sure to come back to you outside of this event. As I said, the event is being recorded, so that will be used as a resource and shared through the Clinks website in the future. And if you've got any sort of tech issues, email the Clinks events mailbox that everybody will have in their inbox, as Bryn, who's on the call, will be kind of managing that. But otherwise, I am going to let us get started so that you can hear from the great speakers that we've got this morning. To start, we're going to do a little bit of sort of scene setting, and thinking about some of the feedback that we hear at Clinks from our members. And I'm going to hand over to Clinks' Head of Influence and Comms, Sam Julius, who is going to be talking us through some findings from one of our recent special interest groups as part of the RR3. So Sam, I'll just bring up your slides for you, but over to you. Welcome and thanks for coming.
Thanks, Emma.
Sam, just while I bring them up, would you do me a favour and just explain the RR3 for anyone that doesn't know on the call?
Yes, of course. Hi, everyone. Lovely to meet you. As Emma says, I'm the Head of Influence at Clinks. We help to run the Reducing Reoffender Third Sector Advisory Group, which is a group of senior leaders working in the voluntary sector of the criminal justice system, advising the MOJ and HPPS on policy issues as and when they arise. It meets quarterly and it deals with both proactive and reactive issues. It looks at things taking a long-term view, but it also reacts to issues as I say, as and when they arise. For example, and I'll talk a little bit about this in the slides, at the moment we're dealing with something that I know a lot of you are dealing with, but that's challenges around vetting. Should we kick off with the slides? So yeah, next slide please, Emma. So every year we set up what are called special interest groups, and these are policy subgroups as part of the RR3, which look at specific areas of policy. This year we are looking at accommodation, employment, commissioning, and staffing, and these slides concern the SIG on staffing. What we wanted to look at was all the various interrelated factors that impact upon staffing levels in the sector. So this gives you kind of the top lines. There was an initial focus on recruitment and retention. The key thing to note is this, of course, varies across the sector. So, for example, there was funding attached to the drug strategy, which meant that there was more funding for staffing, whereas this didn't flow to other areas of the sector. We then looked at the wider societal challenges that impact upon staffing levels, and this predominantly revolves around mental health provision, which impacts upon people's physical ability to do their work, but also the cost of living. We then looked at staff burnout and all the factors that lead to staff burning out, which causes further drain on resources. We also looked at the brain drain. A key issue here was about organisations investing in staff, in upskilling them, and then seeing them move predominantly to statutory organisations. It was something of a double-edged sword because many of the organisations were delighted to see the upskilling of their staff and moving on to brilliant opportunities, but that of course leaves gaps in their workforce. The last point is around the commissioning landscape. This relates to how contracts are commissioned, specifically the length of contracts, with many talking about short-term contracts impeding their ability to retain staff for longer periods of time. Thanks, Emma. So, current challenges around recruitment and retention. Vetting remains arguably the number one issue. Participants all reported long delays in decision outcomes, which impacts on staff retention most obviously, but this had a specific impact on people employing people with lived experience. When it came to the decision outcomes, there was a frustration at the often arbitrary nature, but also the uneven application of decisions. There didn't seem to be a uniform application of how and when people were being rejected for their vetting. We really delved deeply into the issue of lived experience, and the 12-month vetting renewal process can often leave staff with lived experience feeling re-traumatized, and there was a really strong desire for an easier renewals process. Another really important issue was around the increasing complexity of service user need, which requires more staff because there was what we see as an increase in the intensity of cases, which, as we all know, working in the sector can cause issues around traumatization, but also burnout. The combination of all these issues has led to organisations having limited time and capacity for additional training, which is a further factor leading to staff leaving. When it comes to cost, not all contracts and organisations are receiving an inflationary uplift. We all know that inflation has particularly impacted upon smaller specialist organisations, and this also links to issues around full cost recovery of contracts. As I've already mentioned, short-term contracts really lead to this lack of certainty around decision-making timeframes. This can mean eventual loss of staff for more stable employment. And then probably the most obvious one, as Emma's already referenced, pay remains a barrier, as contracts do not provide enough for salaries of more experienced staff, and staff are leaving the voluntary sector due to lower pay. The voluntary sector, as you guys will all have heard before, is perceived as a cheaper model of delivering services rather than a source of expertise. Thanks, Emma. So we wanted to look at the drivers behind burnout, and I've listed a couple of them here. One raised was about the limited induction training within prisons, which impacts on staff investment due to not feeling supported amongst staff. The doing more for less was a key theme. The demands of contracts, the increased complexity of needs, but also just generally the increased levels of demand means that staff have higher caseloads, and as we say, more intense caseloads, and this is leading to burnout. And then the last point was about that increase in service user needs, which puts strain on staff capacity and workload. We then, which will form the second part of the SIG, which has yet to be held yet, we wanted to look at, how could organisations support the well-being of staff? And here we listed a few of the recommendations, which may seem small, but you add them together and they really contribute to greater well-being. One of the ideas was around utilising clinical supervision to support staff. and then reminding staff to celebrate every little success. We work in as we all know, a difficult sector, and it's really important to celebrate those small wins whenever and however they come. We also referenced incorporating shadowing and activity hubs, and lots of really good ideas around buddying systems and mentoring. And then more of a kind of unstructured permission to come together with colleagues without an agenda, including activities to build morale and togetherness. And then finally, the use of externally facilitated peer support groups, including the use of action learning sets, for example. Thanks, Emma. So one of the areas that we wanted to look at was how do we encourage career development and collaboration? And this is about encouraging staff who come into the sector to continue moving up and across the sector. As we've mentioned earlier in this presentation, a lot of the issues is around that brain drain, but it's not just to statutory organisations within the sector, it's also out of the sector. So we wanted to look at how to keep people in the sector. One of the ideas was around the greater use of placements, secondments between the HPPS and the voluntary sector, but also getting HPPS officials to come and work within voluntary organisations to understand more about how these organisations deliver services and more about the realities of their day-to-day. The idea would be to help expand knowledge and experience of workforce, promote better collaboration. There was also the idea of ensuring that HPPS and voluntary staff could be trained together where relevant and appropriate. And then there was the interesting idea about developing middle managers more in order to take pressure off senior leadership. So that would be upskilling with a focus on supporting senior leadership. One of perhaps the most exciting development was around the e-training and learning portal. There's currently a minimal version for CRS providers, but expanding that so that qualifications can be built and can be taken across the sector could be a key avenue through which to upskill staff. And that's all I've got for today.
Thanks very much, Sam. Really useful sort of whistle-stop tour of what I'm sure was a really useful SIG for a few hours last week, I think it was, or a couple of weeks ago. So thank you for putting that together so quickly to kind of share some key findings as part of this event. Has anybody got any question based on what Sam just presented? I did see one pop up in the chat, I believe, from Chris. Could you expand on the premise of activity hubs, Sam?
So, Chris, to be honest with you, we are about to put in the diary the second session, which is focused on solutions. And one of our members had come up with this idea of an activity hub, which is more of a pastoral focus on activities beyond the workplace that can be used to increase well-being. So those would be activities, as I say, beyond your day-to-day work to ensure that people coming to work or not coming in our case, given that we're remote, would be able to go into their day in a slightly better frame of mind. So it may sound slightly woolly, but I think we could all agree that if you're in a happier, healthier place outside of your work, then you're going to feel more content and confident in your workplace.
Thank you, Sam. Has anybody else got any questions relating to what was just discussed at all? Feel free to raise your hand, come off mute, pop something in the chat. Anybody at all? You're escaping, Sam, with any burning questions from the participants.
If anyone wants to get involved with the second half of the SIG, then please do feel free to get in contact with me. I'll put my email in the chat.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Sam. Yeah, please do share your contact details and do get in touch with Sam if you've got any follow-up questions. But thanks for that. That was a really useful sort of scene setting to sort of get us really thinking about the challenges that the sector are facing and potential solutions, but albeit sort of further down the line in the development phase, I guess, is where we're at now. Excellent. And you've got some interest there, Sam, in the chat of people that might be interested. And yes, Patricia will be sharing all the slides that we go through today. So you'll get them as part of the resource pack after this. Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to now hand over to Matina, who is the Head of Regional Operations for London Services at Together for Mental Wellbeing. Matina, while I bring up your slide deck, if you want to sort of introduce yourself and explain a bit about what you'll be talking about today.
Brilliant, thank you, Emma. Good morning all and welcome. Thank you for joining. Just to warn you, there are some works happening right now at my building, so there may be some background noise. Hopefully that's going to be very, very minimal. As Emma said, I work for Together for Mental Wellbeing as a Head of Regional Operations for our London services, and that includes community support and criminal justice. And I'm going to be talking to you today about a research project I undertook as part of my master's in Occupational Psychology a couple of years ago on resilience, employee resilience, and how leaders can actually support it and develop it. And actually that links very, very well with what Sam was just talking about around how do we best support employees. So at the end, of my presentation, you could ask any questions you have, and we can have a chat about the findings or any interesting points for you that came up. Next slide, please, Emma. Talking about resilience and why it is important. It is very, very important because it is very well linked with employee well-being, especially for those working in criminal justice services, like prison settings, for example. We know that our staff experience a lot of adversity due to their workplace that they have to attend to, as well as the people they work with, as they bring lots of traumatic experiences, adverse childhood experiences, etc., etc. Being resilient can then reduce the impact of the stressors that people experience on the workplace, and that protects employees from poor health and from poor well-being as well, burnout, which are amongst some of the negative consequences of work stress, as Sam was actually just mentioning right before. Resilience is also important at the organizational level. It's not only important for the individual, because when organizations have a resilient workforce, that can support them in going through crises and change quite successfully and lead them through changes themselves. So we're approaching resilience both from the individual and the organizational level as well. And what we know from previous research is that there are few individual factors that can support people becoming resilient or maintaining resilience, depend on the circumstances of their lives and their work. For example, increasing self-awareness, showing self-care, etc. But we know that there are also lots of strategies that involve support from the organizations, their supervisors and colleagues. We know that resilience can be developed and it's not stable, and that's why we're talking about it being quite dynamic. It really depends on the life circumstances or the work of people, etc., etc. And the way that I wanted to look at it is like knowing that it's not something that you either have or you have not. It's like, how can we support developing it? Next slide, please. Again, like from the literature, we know that resilience is a term that is very widely used. It can mean different things to different people. It's also a huge variety of definitions in the literature, and some consider it as an individual trait, which then place all the responsibility on the person. So the person, the employee themselves, they have to be resilient. It's all on them. And if they're not, that can be seen as a weakness at times in organizations, can put lots of pressure on the person. And it's really quite short-sighted to see it like that. They are the ones that have to manage adversity and be blamed if all efforts fail. So the way I have approached it is like looking at how the organizations can really support employee resilience, given that it's so important for organizational development, and it can prepare the organization. As I have done in my research, I looked specifically at a sample of liaison and diversion practitioners across the country, because what we know about them is that they work under lots of stress, adverse circumstances in a very fast-paced environment in the courts. They are exposed to adverse circumstances. I spoke earlier about trauma and the experience of vicarious trauma that people have when they work with service users across the criminal justice setting. So it was very, very interesting to see how we can support employees in that respect. At the time as well, being myself head of a service that works within liaison and diversion, it was an interest for me as well to see what it is best that we can do in the organization to support employees working in these settings. Again, like that can apply to different staff across the criminal justice setting. Thank you, Emma. What I did is I looked at 3 different leadership styles, and this is because they have been found to be relevant and important in supporting employee resilience, and it have been positively linked with employee resilience, especially behaviors that relate to transformational or empowering leadership. For example, clarifying goals, fostering growth and participation in decision-making for employees, supporting around work and non-work demands, as well as contingent reward leadership. I looked at some different variables as well. I looked at optimism, which is an individual characteristics, and proactive personality, again, another individual characteristic that people can have. I looked at autonomy that people experience in their work, as well as the support they have from their employees. I want to talk a bit about the different styles that I looked at. Empower leadership. Empowering leaders are the ones that support autonomy, develop the skills of their employees by expressing confidence, delegate tasks to them, and they enable participation, as I said. Contingent reward leadership, for those of you who may not have come across the term, is when the leaders administer positive reinforcers, for example, recognition, acknowledgement, commending staff based on high performance, and that has been also linked very much with resilience. Feedback is especially important, as that includes learning from mistakes, evaluating performance in a continuous way, and signals to the employee recognition that their efforts matter, and that can increase their awareness of how they perform and how to further develop. And transformational leaders are the ones that can promote their followers are thoughtful, creative, they adapt change, focused, and they adapt also to stressful conditions. Emma? So what I found, what I did, sorry, I forgot to mention that what I did a survey study of liaison and diversion staff, and I ended up with 103 members of staff in total, and some of them were community link workers working in community settings, again with the same kind of population. So what this study showed is that the people that took part in the survey were actually quite resilient, which was not surprising. We know that working in criminal justice settings requires for people to be able to face all adversity and continue going. Otherwise, it's like we know that they cannot do it otherwise. People that responded to the survey about being proactive as in their personality. They valued a lot the support from colleagues that they were receiving and found the colleagues very supportive, and they also experienced their work as very autonomous. And this is actually the nature of the role. Being a liaison and diversion practitioner, you have to be on your feet all the time, making decisions on the spot, because the court will need to have some information as soon as possible and cannot really wait for you to sit down and think for a very, very long time. In the study also rated the managers quite highly on the scales on leadership. So they talked about the managers having behaviors that they've been empowering, transformational, and being contingent reward. And the sample also had moderate optimism. Regarding the leadership styles, it was found that transformational leadership was linked more to resilience, compared to the other styles, but all of them were making a significant contribution to people becoming resilient or maintaining their resilience while part of the workforce. What was also found, apart from leadership, is that how important the support networks and autonomy people were experiencing in their role was for them. Next slide, Emma, thank you. So why does this all matter? Why is this important for you to know? What for you and for your organizations? I think what is very special, like hearing from Sam earlier about the challenges in funding this for managers, delivering training for people, ensuring that we have clinical supervision when appropriate, and that we provide reflective practice to our staff. We know that the reality is that lots of it comes with a high cost to organizations. We know that especially like smaller organizations can struggle with that, are finding opportunities like that to develop in their workforce further. So what is quite important, and I wanted to summarize in the next couple of slides for you, is some of the recommendations that you could take on and see how you can implement as leaders in your services, or bring back to your organization to see how you can start looking more into that in practice, because there's some simple ways of improving behaviors for leaders. So these are like some of the examples of the behaviors that are very, very useful for staff so that they can demonstrate resilience. We know that leaders that promote resilience are the ones that support their staff to understand how their roles relate to the rest of the service, of the organization, of what is trying to be achieved, rather than their role sitting in isolation. Really need to feel a purpose in the job they're doing. We know that, like, especially those of us who work within the sector, we know that we're in these jobs because we really want to make a difference. So when people find that purpose and understand the contribution their role makes, that can be very, very important and make a big difference on their resilience. What is very, very important as well is how the objectives and goals of the role relate to what the organization is trying to achieve as a whole, their strategy, for example, and the vision. Leaders that collaborate on decision making can also support resilience. So it's very, very important that when there are decisions to be made, that we involve staff as much as possible at the individual level, group level, organizational level, whatever is most appropriate depending on decision making. It's very, very important that mistakes are allowed and people use them as a way to learn rather than be punished. And also believing that staff have the skills and resources to be able to handle demanding situations. So really showing trust in our staff's skills. It's about giving feedback and giving, as we say, constructive feedback, allowing people to understand what it is that they're doing that works really, really well, and at the same time ensuring that when there is something, a point of development, that this is also brought across to them in a way that they can then use to and utilize to make progress, develop and learn. And again, that's something that comes without a cost, really, like giving that feedback. It can be part of regular supervision that staff receive. It can be part of some ad hoc observations of the work that people are doing on the ground, etc., etc. So it's about keeping that as part of the normal practice in the workplace for leaders. It's also about praising good work when that happens, complimenting staff, and making sure that people are acknowledged for the good work and the effort they're putting in. What we have been doing together in my organization, quite a lot actually. We have a way to record compliments that reach our staff from external stakeholders, normally from service users, their families, sometimes from professionals. And within the leadership team, we're trying to find ways to best celebrate these compliments. Going back to the person, acknowledging the compliment they received, especially if you're a senior leader, it's very, very important for us to be reaching to the ground, like all these frontline workers that work in the organization, and ensuring that all this good work is recognized across the whole of the organization, no matter where you sit in it. Next slide, Emma, please. Similarly to what I was describing, it's very, very important that we as leaders, we lead by doing and not by telling people what to do. We lead by demonstrating the behaviors that we want to be seeing people to demonstrate in the work. And this is one of the behaviors actually of transformational leaders. Leading by example is very, very important. It's very useful to make sure that we develop groups and making sure that we create an environment of team working, group working. We bring people together in the teams to ensure that they learn from one another, they get together, they share experiences of their work, they share feedback, reflect on what has been happening. And this again, I know that lots of us tend to have reflective practice for staff or clinical supervision, but this is something as well that could happen within the regular team meetings that staff have with the managers. Setting clear goals is very, very valuable as well. Making sure that people know what they need to be achieving in the roles, making sure that they can understand what is expected from them, have very, very clear job description and understanding what each element of that job description means for them. So really bringing to life what is on paper. And it's very, very important as well that this happen right from the time of induction and throughout the time with the organization. So they're always clear on what is expected and support them then to make sure that they understand how to reach the goals and what barriers may be getting in the way and all that problem or the solution that can happen between the supervisor, the manager and themselves to ensure that they can progress following that. Respect, that's very intuitive anyway, making sure that staff feel respected, and that the managers really listen to their needs. They're very attentive to the needs. They're there for what has been happening to people. We know that all of us can lead very busy lives. We're not, even though work is a very, very important part of our everyday life, things may be happening in our personal lives as well, and that can impact the way we engage with work, our well-being, etc., etc. So making sure that as managers we're close to staff and really listen to what they need, finding ways to support them into making some adjustments if necessary, adjusting the way the work is delivered, adjusting the pattern of work, etc., is very, very important. And finally, it's about challenging basic assumptions that people may have in the organization, just making sure that we have that open dialogue with our workforce, so people can then express any anxieties. They can come and talk to us about anything that may not be very clear around their job, around the team, the organization, etc., and making sure that we are there to support them. And the last slide is a thank you from me for listening in. I didn't go through much detail about the research itself, so if you have any specific questions around the way I approached it or anything else actually that came out of the results of the survey, then I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Matina. Does anybody have any questions based on that excellent presentation we just heard? Or any thoughts? Has it sparked any sort of ideas or potential challenges that you may be experiencing within your own organizations in relation to some of those ideas that were suggested as a result of the research? Anybody at all? I have a question for you, Matina, if no one else does. I'm going to ping one over to you. So I was really interested in what you were saying in one of the suggestions around collaboration on decision making with leadership and with leaders. And I'm just interested into hearing what you would say based on your research would be how easy that is in practice, and any suggestions in the sense of when decisions need to be made quite quickly by leaders. And I know that from my previous experiences of working within voluntary sector frontline services, is that sometimes decisions feel like they're being made to the practitioners as a result of obviously quick decisions being made and sort of service delivery changes that have to adapt, and they kind of just are sort of sprung on the practitioners, and they're like, okay, now I need to work like this, with not a huge amount of understanding of why those changes might have been made. So I'm interested in sort of how you would tackle that challenge of that collaboration approach, but also when decisions need to be made in a timely manner.
Yes, of course. That's a very, very important question, actually, Emma. And I can totally relate to that being the case in my organization. And I'm sure it has been happening elsewhere as well. It's about what are the decisions that we are involving our staff in, and what it is that it is a decision that the organization needs to make. Some decisions, yes, you cannot involve everyone because they need to happen very, very quickly. But it's always very useful to have your ear on the ground, understanding what staff needs. So when it is that you need to make a decision very quickly, you know what this is coming from, you know how that may impact the staff. You are there to then explain why a decision was made the way it was made, so staff understand that this was not an opportunity for an open collaboration. And again, I think it's about making sure that we use all the resources and spaces we have with our teams, like ANOA together, and I'm sure that happens everywhere as well. The managers have regular meetings with their teams. It's about using that time and space to ensure that anything that needs to change is brought to people. There is that consultation process. And it doesn't take long to do. I think like we're all so overworked and so busy that we forget that it can take very, very little time to involve others in making decisions together and collaborate. And it saves in the long run, because that signals to people that you care about them, they matter to the organization, you support them to go through any changes in a more positive way as well. So there are lots of benefits, and there are lots of different ways to do it in the organizations.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Because I think that's a real key point, isn't it? And you referenced that in your presentation around ensuring that people feel that they understand how their role links to the wider strategic aims of the organization. Because then you understand that you may have to ultimately go with some decisions that may not be in your best interest, or even in the people that were working with your service users' best interest, but understanding that there's that bigger picture. And if staff don't understand that, or understand how they link to that, sometimes there can be sort of understandable resistance to those changes that come about.
Exactly, and transparency is a key, actually. As a leader, you need to be transparent with your staff as to why you're making decisions a certain way and not a different way.
Excellent. We've got some questions coming through the chat now. Chris, are you happy to come and sort of, rather than me read your question, are you happy to sort of put your question to Matina yourself?
Hi, Martina. Thank you for your presentation. Just to think, do you have any suggestions of when somebody is a senior leader, maybe a little bit higher up in the organisation, how they can advocate for themselves in regard to wellbeing? Because I've found that for myself and others in a similar position, when you're at the higher end, you almost have to feel a bit infallible in regard. You need to be strong because you've got a big team who are going through all of the things we've discussed today. How can we advocate to make sure that we're kind of protected in terms of reasonable adjustments and support for well-being?
Yes, very, very key. And actually, thanks for bringing that, Chris, because it's not that leaders have to do everything and then don't get in that support themselves from their managers. It's actually like something that needs to be happening across the organization at all levels. It's very, very important that what I talked about really happens for those of us who are senior leaders in organizations, that we have managers who really trust in our abilities, give us the autonomy, and they are there as well to offer that feedback on how we're doing. Some organizations use appraisals, for example, as a way to do that, but it has to be a more regular thing. I think it takes a bit of, I talked about proactive personalities, so I think it takes a bit of like some personal responsibility in not like being resilient, but kind of like getting that across to your leader, that this is what you require to be sufficient in your role, that this is what you require for your well-being. That honesty, that like building that support relationship right from the beginning is very, very important. And don't forget that, yeah, like we all need to be resilient to be in this job. I talked about frontline staff because of like the adversity that they face, and it's very, very important we acknowledge that, but it's certainly something that needs to happen across the organization.
Absolutely. No, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Matina. We've got a second question there from Naomi. Naomi, are you able to, did you want to put your question? Thanks.
Hello. Thanks for your presentation. Sorry. I just wondered if you wouldn't mind just quickly giving your opinion on the best way that sort of managers, anyone in senior leadership can give feedback, but also maybe if it's a new team, helping staff to feel comfortable sort of receiving feedback and giving feedback as well.
Yeah. Naomi, I think like that really needs to be embedded in the culture of the organization, that like that we are open to asking for feedback and we're open to receiving for feedback. I think it's always useful to have not exactly some training, but like have that awareness of how to give feedback in a way that is constructive. And that's why I spoke about constructive feedback. It's about making sure that we're not talking about people making mistakes. We're talking about people developing and learning. And this is part of the conversation and the culture that we want to be having in the organization. It's about, in team meetings, for example, we utilize that space to give feedback to one another about, I don't know, like an event that the team took part in, or sharing some feedback from a service user or from a senior leader in the organization about the specific team and the work they're doing, or the commissioner. Actually, we do get lots of feedback from commissioners that, given the press, the time pressures, we're not always sharing with staff, and it's about finding every opportunity. And I think, especially with our one-to-ones that we have with our staff, this is a process that we can really implement at every one-to-one. It can be part of the supervision agenda at every opportunity we have with staff. So it's kind of like using every opportunity to make it part of the culture, really, and people receive it in a way that it's normalized and it's not relating to them having done something wrong. It's about what they learn and how they develop. What we do together as well is we have the personal development plans as well, and we keep having conversations with people about how they want to develop in their role. So using an opportunity like that can also be very, very helpful.
Thank you so much. Yeah, those are really useful tips, and I'm definitely gonna implement all of those. So thank you so much. Thank you.
No worries.
Thank you. Thanks, Naomi, and completely echo you, Matina, in the sense of it becoming a culture that part of the culture on the daily, really, as much as regular as possible, to have that feedback so that it doesn't feel uncomfortable at that potential annual review stage. Yes. When you have to have a really sort of potentially awkward conversation with your line manager where you're discussing feedback when you haven't discussed it throughout the whole of the rest of the year. So making it as part of that daily practice, each supervision, and making it feel much more normalized, as you said.
And just to add to that as well, actually, it's what I was saying earlier about leaders leading by example. So it's not about myself giving feedback to my direct reports. It's about asking for them to also give me feedback on how I'm doing. It's kind of like that 360 approach. It's not only for my manager to give me that feedback. It's like getting that from colleagues, getting that from my direct reports, etc., etc. So that's what I'm talking about, like being a culture in the organization, really. And like all of us as like our leaders in services are responsible for leading by example on that as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Matina. That was really, really useful. Thanks for your presentation and for those responses to questions. I'm now going to hand over to our next sort of segment of the event, and handing over to Dawn Harrison, who is the Criminal Justice Service Manager up at Changing Lives. And she is joined by her colleague, Dr. Angelica Stromeyer from Northumbria University Design School. And they're going to talk through some of the work that's been going on at Changing Lives. So I'll hand over to you both.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming along today. I was sitting listening to the speakers beforehand thinking, oh, it's quite a gloomy picture out there at the minute, isn't it? And I'm certainly not sitting here saying we have the answers by any means. But what we're going to share with you today is a programme that both Angelica and I have been working on for the past 18 months. And that programme is called Story Chair. So just to give a little bit of background about Story Chair, where it came from, what it's all about. It started, as many things do, with a conversation. And we're invited down to the cathedral to see the building and explore why the women we support weren't accessing that venue. what happened across a little room at the side of the cathedral, which we now know is historically the crypt. It was a place where you would go to say goodbye to your dead. And one of the women said, wouldn't that be lovely to have a space like this where you could come along and just say goodbye to an old story that you no longer wanted told about you? In that moment, Story Chair was born, but we also knew that the women made comments such as places like these aren't for people like us, which for us was a real shame to hear, but also for the cathedral in Newcastle. He wanted to do something about changing that. So at the same time or thereabouts, there was a storm in the northeast, which brought down a 200-year-old Turkey oak tree on a National Trust site. It was really random how this happened. We had a conversation with National Trust about working with some of the women and working on an outside programme, reconnecting people with their space. And they were talking about this tree that they had and said, I tell you what, if the women are going to make a chair, would you like the wood from this tree to make the chair? At that point, we said yes before the sentence was finished and had no idea how we were going to move that tree. But it all came together in a bit of a conversation with Angelica and I around what does this look like. So we tasked the women with going off and exploring chairs and what that might look like for the women. And they came back and told us that did we know there were 7 universally accepted ways to tell any story? We didn't. So they told us it was a two-way exchange, like you were just talking about before. They told us about the ways. We wrote the programme, we took it back to them and said, is this what you want to see happen? So they explored their stories through the programme and the design of the chair. In the photographs, you can see Dick, who was the furniture maker who was commissioned to make the chair with the women. So there was a design brief that certainly didn't come from us, I'm pleased to say, because the women did a much better job. And then the programme was designed and rolled out across the whole of the Northumbria area in the women's hubs that we have, which are community settings where we see women for appointments and they receive interventions. Do you want to move the slides on, Angelica?
Yes, sorry, I have a lot of things. Yes, so thanks for that introduction, Dawn. So I'm Angelica, and I've been working with Dawn on this. And on this slide, you can just see a little bit of what the program looked like. So we've got these 2 characters here, which were designed with the women. They're kind of, their stories have a little bit of background, but they're not finished. And that's really, really important that they're short starting points for conversation rather than complete characters or case studies or personas. And so that comment of these 7 universal or kind of somewhat universal ways of telling a story were really the starting point. And we combined each of those different storytelling tropes with a different craft, textile, or paper-based activity. So for example, as you can see, we've got these 8 sessions where, for example, in session 3 was the trope of rags to riches, which is any story kind of where, you know, you start with people in rags and then at the end of the story, they're kind of a rich person. There we used kind of fabric scraps and turned them into beautiful beads to help people reframe certain experiences through that activity and through the conversations that happened through that activity. And so each session was based around something similar to that. And the final one was a reflexive session where we kind of thought about the program as a whole, what was useful about it, what wasn't useful about it, how could it be improved for the next iteration. So including not only staff, but also the women and kind of the design of the program as a whole.
And that's the magnificent chair itself. So the first image that you can see there is on launch day of the chair. And the chair went back to the crypt because that's where the women felt it should start its journey, because as it was born there. The next space is Seton Delaval Hall, which is a National Trust site. And that very space historically was again a space that you would have private conversations. So it felt very fitting that the chair goes there. And the last space that you can see where the chair is currently sitting, although it's going to move soon in time for International Women's Day, is Gibbside, again, a National Trust site.
And yeah, as Dawn already said, the chair was made by Nick James, but the brief of what it should look like really came from the women as part of the program, and kind of follow-on design activities that we did with the women to think about conceptually what should it represent and physically what should it look like as well. All of that learning kind of led to the development of a toolkit that we put together, which we'll share an email address of how to get access to that if you want it. But essentially the toolkit is in 3 parts, where the first part is just information about the project, kind of a more in-depth view of what we've shared today. The second is implications for practice and policy, which includes a number of 1-page documents with clear guidance on how to implement these kinds of creative projects in services, how it can support inclusion in heritage organizations like the National Trust, and also kind of thinking a bit more about what is actually needed for staff to be able to engage in these kinds of activities. And then the last part is kind of activity sheets and resources to really just pick up immediately and run with some of the activities we designed as part of drop-ins, as part of one-to-ones, as part of staff peer reflexive practice potentially, or lots of other kind of programs that you might be writing yourselves. This was co-designed with the women, the visual look of it, what should be included, all of this includes the women. And very, very importantly, it's kind of a framework, not a template. So it's supposed to aid you in designing your own things, using it, adapting it in a way that's useful for your organization rather than copying exactly what it is we did. And if you'd like a copy of it, feel free to email me and I can send it to you. And then we can also have a chat about it if this is something you'd be interested in.
Oh, yeah, the reason that we're all here today, whilst delivering this project in the women's hubs, a side impact that we didn't foresee coming was the staff involvement. So staff were involved in the sessions, took part, shared some of what they felt comfortable sharing. But you can see the comments that were being made. I felt lighter. I felt so much better. It was nice just to be women in the room. So Angelica and I captured those comments straight away and started to think, oh, have we missed the trick here? We've developed this program, which is brilliant and encourages people to share their stories and do no further harm. So we have the characters in place so that everything is trauma informed. But actually, what we didn't think of was the impact on the staff. And the second comments are all around they didn't know that this was what it was, didn't know that they could do that, didn't know that they could operate in a creative manner within the world of criminal justice, because we have a staff team that are highly skilled within all of the pathways that they have to develop. But the one pathway that was perhaps neglected somewhat in the launch of this CRS contract, etc., is creativity. And that naturally led to the staff asking us, when do we get to do this?
It was really, I think, quite surprising that as we were doing the program, Dawn and I, after every session, would, as part of the kind of research project, would reflect on what had happened, what was going on. And it came up for us every single session as well, that all of these kinds of comments were also comments that we made as the facilitators of the program. So it wasn't just the attending and participating in the program from the staff, but also as facilitators of this program, we had very kind of similar experiences. So really, really importantly, staff well-being when participating in and in delivering these kinds of creative activities, where making is kind of central to the session rather than just speaking or writing things down, but really focusing on kind of the materials and the meanings that can be embedded in these different ways of expressing yourselves, that they felt important to us. But it also really came up in reflections that, you know, this was really, really nourishing to us, and that it was kind of benefiting us individually and personally as well. And we knew that this was something really important to look into in more detail to really figure out what was happening. But we also knew that neither of us really had the time at the moment to really focus in on that and to spend the time to really look into it. So in kind of the spirit of allyship across academia and kind of the third sector support service, we kind of put our heads together, and we're now working with Ingrid Bale, who is a PhD student looking specifically into this topic. So hopefully in a year's time or 2 years' time, we'll have some more information about exactly how these creative practices can support staff well-being specifically.
So yeah, when we were looking at what to share today, what were the important points to share, I think one of the main ones for us was the importance and the comment that was in the chat before about senior management having the ability to speak out for yourself or to advocate for yourself. It is really important to feed yourself, and I don't mean with food. So I think it's really important to go and experience new things as a manager and share that learning so that it's much more of a two-way exchange. And throughout this partnership with Northumbria University, that has most definitely happened for me. So there's a different set of languages, as I'm sure you all know, working within criminal justice. What I was able to take part in was a different language altogether, working with academics, being in the university, finding out what they're interested in, how they communicate with each other, and sharing some of that learning. But also, I think generating space and time is important just to think. Because like we were saying before, as managers, you're often tasked with having the answers. And it's really hard actually to say, I don't know. But it's something that we'll definitely have to practice doing, because in what world do we know all the answers? I certainly don't. And it's a shift in development that my team are getting used to, with me saying, I don't know, can we think about that together? But I think also the importance of capturing that growth and documenting it and sharing it. And I've had the privilege of working with Angelica now for quite a while, and I'm very familiar with that exchange of how she captures things, how we then feedback on it. But there's also the extra resources that come along with working with the universities. Sometimes extra money, sometimes not. Sometimes it's about shared experiences or resources that they have available. Angelica, do you want to say a bit more about that part?
Yeah, so in this particular project, it was around time, really. So the sessions were co-designed. There was a lot of time behind the scenes kind of that are needed to run these kinds of things, running to the shops, getting snacks and that kind of thing, but also resources around skills. Dawn and her team are incredibly skilled at what they do, but there's other kinds of skills that they don't have. For example, the designerly side of things. So being able to produce a toolkit, for example, that looks the way it does. That was kind of an additional resource that isn't necessarily always monetary, but there's kind of these different networks, these different types of skills that are maybe not in the service at the time, and kind of just I think that space to think. So kind of moving to a different physical space like a university or a different meeting space kind of also creates a different way of thinking and allows for different kinds of thinking that aren't maybe necessarily just about the day-to-day, but that kind of give a bit of space for reflection about connecting back to that bigger issue, which I think is also something that Matina said was quite important.
You want to move the slide on? Yeah.
Sorry.
Go.
There's lots of benefits that kind of come with working academia, but I kind of felt it was very important as well to highlight some of the challenges of it, because there definitely are a few. And I think one really big one to keep in mind is that timelines are very, very different. Academia can move incredibly slowly. Anything to do with kind of research funding takes a very, very long time. But at the same time, there are also elements that can mobilize really quickly. And again, that time issue is kind of a really important one, and catching people at the right time when they're thinking about similar things can be a really valuable way of getting things going really, really quickly, even when other things sometimes take a really long time. Dawn, I don't know if you want to say a bit more about this two-way exchange as well, because I think just expanding a little bit what academia can do. Often, I get asked, can you help evaluate this, or can you do some underlying research to explore that? But there's a lot of different things that can come along to the kinds of research that are possible, and allowing kind of space and time to follow shared curiosities and to follow those kind of paths that seem a little strange at first, but that allow you to move into a different way of thinking, different way of doing things. And the question of, we're noticing this particular thing, what do you think of that, is kind of one of the keys to an academic's heart. So rather than coming with kind of finished proposals, and this goes in both ways, coming with kind of open questions rather than closed ones.
Yeah, definitely. It's more than an evaluation, although undoubtedly the world that we're in, that is often asked for. It's much more about sitting around a different table. And if we can influence some of that curiosity and say, actually, this is a trend that we're seeing coming up. What are you saying? What do you think about that? Do you have anybody that's particularly looking at that area already? Which is how we ended up working with Ingrid on the PhD. But it also can be not the obvious suspects. So I think it would be too tempting working in the service that I manage to look at criminology or psychology students. Even sociology would perhaps be a stretch. Actually, Angelica works in a design department. And so if you do reach out to universities, please broaden who you approach, because Angelica's worked with Changing Lives for quite some time now on different programs. But also I think the skill around being able to design a service or a program that actually we didn't say that it had benefited staff, but it most definitely has, is an added plus, but now is something that we're both exploring with Ingrid. So please reach out beyond criminology departments.
Yeah, hopefully some of that was useful. Just a few reflections on kind of the role of creativity and staff well-being, and how kind of working in cross-sector collaborations can be beneficial for that as well, for frontline as well as management staff, I guess. And yeah, our email addresses are there again, and if you would like the toolkit, just put it in the chat and I will send it to you. But thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you both. Thanks, Dawn. Thanks, Angelica. That was really, really interesting and really great to see some imagery of the sort of creative approach that has been taken up at Changing Lives. Does anybody have any questions for Dawn or for Angelica, or reflections on that? Nothing coming through. I think for me, it's so refreshing to see sort of innovative ways of engaging with staff, even though that wasn't your aim at the beginning. It was very much a tool or a approach designed to work with the women, and the fact that there's been a sort of knock-on effect for your staff is really, really fantastic. And I guess it makes me think about other organisations. We know that there is some really great creative work in criminal justice, and I wonder how much sort of leaders within those organisations think about the enjoyment and the impact on well-being of staff, as opposed to always focused on the service users, because that's always our priority. But it'd be really interesting for people to reflect on that within their own organisations. Jacqueline. Sorry, you're still on mute.
Right, I thought I clicked it off. Brilliant presentation, really, really insightful. I'm the chair of Plius Resettlement, so criminal justice. But everything that Angelica and Dawn, you spoke to my core HRD specialist background, and I do emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence, as well as emotional resilience. So everything that you're saying actually feeds into it. But what I wanted to find out about the toolkit, which I love, and I think is really, really brilliant to sort of like bring out the best in people, is it adaptable for sort of like the service users as well? Could you adapt it so that not only do you empower and motivate your staff, but also be in a position to use elements of it to bring out the best in your service users?
So
Yeah.
yes is the answer. Massive yes. So a side impact that also happened was that we had a group of women that had taken part in Story Chair that were coming to the end of their orders and didn't want to be known as experts by experience, because that very experience is what they're trying to leave behind. So they came up with a bit of a tongue-in-cheek name and called themselves the chair takers. We don't make decisions about where that chair goes. Hallelujah. They make the decisions. But what we're in the process of doing is training the chair takers to deliver some of the toolkit. Because what the toolkit does is generates confidence in actually one size doesn't fit all. And nor should it. You know, you have to try on a few pair of shoes before you find the right fit. So I think the toolkit is designed to support people, regardless of whether you have a criminal conviction or not. And that is something that we've definitely, we're comfortable with now, but it was a surprise element initially, I think. Angelica, do you want to say any more about that?
Yeah, just to add that, I think the reason why it's quite a big toolkit, and it's sometimes a little bit wordy, but that is exactly to explain, please use these things and adapt them. Use them for what you think they're useful, and use them in ways that are meaningful to you. So it's got kind of a lot of high level information on like conceptually how to think about, you know, hope as a practice in service delivery, but it also has super practical things like here is a worksheet that you can use, or one of the things in the game is in the toolkit is a game that is an adapted version of one of the activities we did in the program, where the women said, you know, why is it only our small group that is getting this? Every woman in the service should be able to get this kind of support. Let's, you know, why is this not a game? Let's make this an actual game. So then we kind of worked with that smaller group of women to actually co-design the game, and the game is now in the toolkit, which can be photocopied and used as you see fit. And so some of the tools we already know have already been used in different services. They've been used as part of teaching in health. They've been used part of teaching in the law school. So it's really, you know, use it as you see fit and adapt it and change it. And the whole premise of the project, like Dawn said, is not one size fits all. So if an element of the toolkit sounds useful or inspires another thing that you want to do, kind of it's there as a support mechanism to give confidence to do that. Yeah, I think that's, for me, one of the most important bits. It's that lifting up of the kind of creativity and not just copying what we did.
Right, brilliant. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks, Jacqueline. And thank you so much, Dawn and Angelica. Really interesting. I think the one thing that is sticking in my head as well is the point you made, Dawn, about not knowing all the answers, managers feeling okay to say, I don't know. I think that sometimes as managers or even senior leaders within organizations, everybody feels that's not an option, and you have to have an answer. But knowing that and feeling confident to say, I don't know, is really, really important, and probably will help your staffing team realize that you're not that sort of leader who knows absolutely everything and has always got it right. Because as we learned through sort of Matina's presentation, thinking about how it's okay to make mistakes and that should be encouraged and then learning from them. So yeah, really useful. Thank you both. I'm now going to be handing over to John. So John is the director at Hear Me Out, and he's going to share some reflections from his organisation. So over to you, John.
Thanks, Emma. Hi everybody. Yes, I'm from Hear Me Out. We do music activities with people in the immigration system in detention centres and asylum hotels and places of that kind. Um, and so so not the criminal justice system itself, but I think there's lots of tie-ins, lots of connections. I'm going to share. Well, before I share the screen, I had a conversation a few months ago with someone who was a colleague of mine for many years in the organisation. We worked together quite closely for about 13 or 14 years, and so we kind of met up to catch up. And in this conversation, she told me what it had been like for her to spend a lot of time going into detention centres for many years. And it was a conversation, and in what ways that was difficult for her because of her family history. Her father was from Chile and had been imprisoned in Chile under Pinochet, and in all the time we'd worked together quite closely and talked about a lot of things with each other. That was a conversation that we'd never had. It was quite so. So I think some of the things I'm about to tell you, in a way, are sort of the way I kind of think of it is, well, that shouldn't happen again. If those kinds of things should be upfront during the course of doing the work, not just reflected on afterwards. So let me just share my screen. So I'm going to just do a bit of a whistle-stop tour, I hope. I'm going to try and be whistle-stop anyway, about some of the work we've been doing in this area. And now I can't see the thing. Oh, sorry, I'm just struggling here. Wait a second. Is that the one? That's it. Okay. Okay, so we've done a lot of work in this area and sort of in related things over a number of years. And I think if I think back a good few years, I remember a conversation with another colleague, someone who'd been doing a lot of work in detention centres, running music sessions for a long time, about 5-6 years ago, who was saying, well, she needed to take a break from it because of the stress on her. And I realized that we didn't really have anything in place to address that, other than just hearing it afterwards and then trying to be responsive and warm and helpful when the thing was reported. But we weren't picking that up earlier on. COVID just changed so many things in how we operate. And we had to start thinking very differently about how we communicate and what we communicate about in the team. For an organization working in the immigration system and with all of which is kind of imbued with issues around race and power and equality, the Black Lives Matter movement really made us think about some of the wider issues, equity issues, in our work. The immigration system's been going through all kinds of twists and turns and difficulties in the last few years, and that's really keeping us on our toes. And overall, I guess there's a sense in which, not just in our sector, but I think in all sorts of sectors, maybe this is a pandemic effect more than anything else. Staff wellbeing has become a thing in the sense that it's something that employers and companies are much more aware of and talking much more about. So I guess what I'm saying is, over the last 4 or 5 years, our whole way of thinking about this stuff has changed such a lot. So what I'm going to do is just really go through different kind of collections of stuff that we've been involved with. And some of them, this first one, is things that directly address well-being. But then there's some sort of wider stuff around work practices. So the wider stuff about how we interact with colleagues, how we organize things for the staff team. I think this picks up on some of the stuff, Matina, you were talking about. It's not, and then then there's some whole organization stuff. So I think I'm going to find myself picking up on themes that people have been speaking about already this morning. So just quickly, here are some of the things we've been doing. We started during lockdown, mainly online, obviously, just spending a bit of social time together. We've tried to respond better to when people are reporting stress, or we can see stress, for example, by spending a bit of money enabling people to buy things that will reduce their stress, you know, which might be yoga or a bit of counselling or something, you know, something like that. We've instituted, this is something much more expensive. We've instituted a sort of clinical supervision. It's not individual, but something that we do as a team or have done as a team, and with a specialist practice of psychologists and psychotherapists who work with organisations that are doing difficult work and dealing with trauma and so on and so forth. And that's been really important to help give people's time and space to talk about things like how they're feeling in the job and how the stresses of the work cause the stress, the distress, the stress and distress that work causes. That's something that we are finding working in the immigration system, that we're needing to talk about with each other much more than we used to. We have identified a little bit of money that we can spend on staff wellbeing, and we're involved in a big, potentially quite big, well, it is going to be a big action research project with 2 other music organisations and 2 research institutions to find out, to pilot and test and evaluate different approaches to caring, to support and care for the artists who deliver participatory work in prisons and in our settings and other places like that. So these are all things that directly address well-being, if you like, as it kind of hits us, if you like, or things that are problems for that they're sort of direct interventions, responsive interventions, if you like. And then we've been doing some stuff around just the way we organize things in the team. Part of the context for this is that we've grown from an organization 5 or 6 years ago of just like about 3 staff to now we have a team of about 10 sort of staff and sort of regular freelancers. So the team has grown a bit as well, and that's part of the context for this. So of course this hybrid working isn't there, and you know, being on Zoom a lot and rethinking how we use the office. We actually moved offices because we realized we needed a space to meet in rather than a space to work in. So we have a space that's more our own, that we share with another organization, that we can actually all gather in, and there's enough space for us all, but we don't use it all the time. And we have, because we have a lot of part-time working, so quite a fragmented workforce in a way. We have got a day in the week when we all try to gather, as many of us as possible, in person and others on Zoom, and we always have a team meeting on that day to kind of just share stuff. And so trying to make sure that people have got the flexibility to kind of work in the way that works for them, that fits with other things they've got going on in their life, but also kind of meets the needs of the organization as well, and that we're communicating the right amount, that kind of stuff. We have a much more dispersed, I mean, some years ago, it would have been quite rare to have someone outside London. We've now got people in different parts of the UK and a fundraiser in Germany, and, you know, that kind of thing. So those kinds of things have changed a lot, and we've been able to become more flexible, I suppose. But we've had to sort of assert some of the time and what we need in order to make sure people are in touch with each other. There's a kind of balancing act there. Our fundraising has been successful enough in the last few years for us to have been able to do some quite large salary increases. So we did do about 10% over the when was it? Last financial year. We increased salaries by inflation. I'm sure that was helpful. But these other things are things that aren't particularly expensive, but they make a big difference to people's experience of working in the organization, I think. And then there's been some work on the left-hand side there. There's some stuff around communication in subgroups. As the organization's grown, we've had to think more about how we organize communication that's not one-to-one, and it's not everybody, it's somewhere in between the two. So we've organized our staff team into sort of little clusters. They're not teams exactly, because they're too small for that, but people doing related work. And we've kind of made some agreements about how often those people are going to meet with each other and how often they're going to meet with me and that kind of thing. So that's trying to put some structure in that helps people to be in touch with each other, to have opportunities to find out what they need to find out, to share, to support each other. And it's a kind of, hopefully an extra level of autonomy for people who are doing related stuff. And then with artists who are delivering programs in various settings, we've started talking to them more about that work. So we'll organize a block of work. They might do, 7 or 8 weeks work in the same setting, and then there'll be a pause. And before and after that block, we will kind of get together with that group of artists who've delivered that work or are about to deliver that work, so that issues can be raised and things anticipated and learning take place, and people again can support each other. So I think this is all stuff around, sort of how you organize things with the team, and the communication and the working arrangements and all of that, how that can all impact on well-being as well, because everything impacts on somebody's well-being. It's not just the things you do about well-being, if you like. So we haven't done all these things particularly with well-being in mind, but they have an impact on it, I suppose. And then finally, gosh, I better stop soon, but this slide, there's so much in here. But as an organization, we've started to take, in the last 2 or 3 years, co-creation across the organization very seriously, if you like, moving a collaborative approach at not taking the collaborative approach that we have in our artistic programs in detention centers and so on, and taking some learning out of that and bringing that into how we run the organization, how we make decisions, how we recruit, how we include people in discussions, how we make decisions collaboratively. And that means thinking about involving experts by experience, people with lived experience at different levels in decision making, in the board, in other projects, in working out a fundraising campaign, things like that. But but the same ethos, it has to permeate the team, because I always think if it doesn't work all the way through, then it's not going to work at all. You need that same ethos to run through all different parts of your work, I suppose. And then linked to that, we've been doing some work on trauma-informed practice, workshops for staff and artists to help us think about how we can work in a way that will support being trauma-informed. We have a member of staff in the team who has a particular role around sort of advising the rest of us on best practice in how we work with our participants, with people with lived experience. And we've started we've got a sort of pilot creative mentoring scheme going on at the moment, which I think is going to be really important in terms of creating a sort of holistic way of supporting people's development that we can use with people who are in the team, artists, people with lived experience, musicians with lived experience of detention who are joining the artistic team, or all those kinds of things. So there's this whole organizational level, as well as the sort of work practices and the specific sort of well-being initiatives. So some of as I said, it's important to note, like we didn't go into all of this stuff thinking well-being. But I think as Matina was sort of saying, it's about the whole well-being is about the whole environment ultimately. Otherwise, you're being reactive. We're sort of, we might be trying to help people who are getting really stressed without dealing with what might be the sort of deeper causes of that stress that are under our control, that are in our environment. So, yeah, so that's just to kind of try to kind of indicate really quickly some of the things that we've been doing, and the importance, I think, of looking at that wider picture, and then just no, I'm not going to talk about that. So that journey, yeah, I think learning some of the things I've been sort of noticing or trying to learn as we've gone along. There are things we used to do that we considered that we kind of knew weren't quite right, but we did them anyway, like expecting people expecting freelancers to put time in for nothing to help us out with something. And they did it out of the goodwill, and we knew that they did that, but it wasn't right, and we knew it. And now we just wouldn't do that anymore. I think there's been a real shift there. I think one of the justifications for some of this work that we've been doing on how we work together, co-creation, and some of those internal work practices, and spending money on the team and on team well-being and so on, that there's a cost to that. But I think that one of the justifications for that, obviously aside from the duty of care, is that how we do the work is also part of the work, because we're modeling things for other people. We're showing how we're helping to model how we want everyone in the organization to work with each other. We're helping to model for the people who the charity is for, what we can do, what they can achieve, and so on and so forth. I've noticed, as someone who's been around the block a few times and been managing charities for quite a few years, there are things that once upon a time I might have considered just a given, just I was really sure about, like good recruitment practices. I've done a lot of recruitment over the years, and I had sort of developed a way of approaching it, which I thought was pretty good. And then all this stuff came along, and I realized that actually there were some profound problems with it, with, like the way that equal opportunities approaches to recruitment are very good at being fair to the people who apply, but completely hopeless at addressing the question of who gets to apply in the first place. And as a result of that, we've been doing some recruitment recently, and we've made some really quite substantial changes, which we're going to need to sort of write up in procedures subsequently, to try and change who gets to apply, who gets to be in the field, so that we can diversify the team and bring more lived experience into the team. So yeah, I've sort of needed to be up for re-examining long-held assumptions, if you like. And I've someone who collaborative leadership, I think I always like to think that I'm good at listening to people and good at including people in discussion, but I think I've also been rather good at assuming that ultimately it was for me to make a decision. And I think one of the things here has been that delegation is autonomy is a really important component of well-being, and that means delegation. And it means not delegating tasks only, but also delegating decisions and letting people just get on with it and work out what to do and lead in their own sphere. So I've had some learning there. And then some learning around, well, yeah, as I was saying, sort of that well-being, there are things you can do for well-being that don't touch the whole organization kind of issues, but ultimately there are issues about equity and issues about power. And I hope that we're on a journey to sort of addressing those. They're big and long-term issues, and that means it's never finished. Okay. I hope that's striking some chords.
That was great. Thank you so much, John. Thanks for those sort of really honest reflections. And I think your final point there about it being never finished is key, and is key to the discussions that we've had today. Well-being isn't as the reason we've put on this event, it's not an easy sort of one-size-fits-all approach to working with the workforce and working out what works for different people. And I think that point of consistently reflecting on what works for you as a leader, what works for the rest of your leadership team, what works for your sort of frontline staff across all levels of management, and thinking about what can change, particularly in line with some of those real significant challenges that all organisations in some ways have been through over the last 3 years. So yeah, really interesting reflections from you there, John. Has anybody got any questions for John at all, based on what he went through there? Caroline.
Yeah, not so much a question really, but just I could really relate to what you were saying, John, about kind of how we have to challenge ourselves as leaders, and particularly about creating different roles for staff, and sort of creating space for people to have more autonomy, and that link to well-being, which I think is really significant. And it's certainly one, as we grow in our organisation, that's a challenge for me to be really thinking about that at the moment. But I know that does make a big difference to people, that they can feel they've got a sense of autonomy over their work area.
Thanks, Caroline. I mean, the other side of it, I suppose, is about that need for structure as well. And certainly, because we've grown a bit, that's another reason why we're needing to put a bit more structure in. So a bit, clarity about roles, and not just leaving people to sort of work it all out for themselves. So there's a sort of balance between autonomy but structure that's supportive rather than kind of confining, I suppose, would be the aim there.
Completely. Thanks, John. Joanna.
Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation. It was so helpful. And my the organisation I work for is similar size. So I've just been taking photos of all the slides. But this might be a bit of a reductive question, but I was just wondering which of the changes that you spoke about was the hardest to implement?
That's a good question. I mean, I think I suppose there might be some, I might be missing something here, but I think in general, it's the whole organization stuff. I mean, if you've got the money, there are certain things you can do there are some things you can do quite easily without money, and some things you can do quite easily if you've got a bit of money. But there are no quick fixes when it comes to whole organization change. So the stuff around co-creation, that's a lot of work, and not all of it's been easy. I think we're on a good track with it, but it's, we're going to be working on this for a few years. We've got this massive action plan, to really bring people with lived experience fully into the team and have the whole organization imbued with those people and have lived experience sort of equally balanced with sort of professional know-how in when decisions are getting made at different levels in the organization. That's about sort of changing procedures, and kind of growing talent. So I guess those are kind of longer term challenges, really.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks, John. Any other questions, or we'll move on to our final segment of the event? I think we're ready for that. Excellent, thanks, John. I'm now going to introduce, last but by no means least, Lucy, who's on the call today and is another member of our advisory forum and is the CEO at the Newbridge Foundation, and she's going to explain what we're going to do now for the final part of this session.
Great, thanks, Emma. Hi, everyone. So yeah, just to kind of recap, I guess, a little bit on our thinking when we were sort of putting this event together, is that I think we all know that wellbeing and resilience are really important, but I think we're all so busy all the time that it can be really difficult to kind of think about, well, how do we do something about it then? So we thought this was a good opportunity to kind of bring us together and think about what does it mean in practice, and to think about some practical tools. And we hope that you can go away from this event and think, okay, I've heard some really good ideas about things that I could do in my own organisation, or reflections from what other people have done that might help me to think about the journey we can go on, rather than it just being this sort of nebulous topic that you're thinking, I really need to do something about wellbeing and resilience, but I don't know what yet. So we thought that to end the session, what could be quite helpful is to spend some time maybe in breakout groups, just talking, again, perhaps more practically, thinking about any reflections you've got, or questions or practical things that you just love to get other people's thoughts or advice or tips on. So sharing your own best practice, or kind of leaning on each other for advice on more specific areas that we've gone into at some point during the discussion today. So the idea is we'll divide into separate groups for anyone who can stay and is interested in joining that discussion. We understand you're all very busy, so if anybody needs to leave, that's absolutely fine. But the next section will be those small group conversations about anything that's particularly resonated for you today, or that you'd like a bit more discussion on. And there'll be one person in each group who'll be kind of making some notes on the key topics that come up as well, so that we can summarise anything useful afterwards too. So this is your opportunity to head off if you need to go. And anybody who is left and is keen to talk, then we'll divide into groups and have that conversation. And thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Lucy. I'm actually going to stop recording now, because we won't record the discussions as we'll be in separate groups, and we can see numbers dwindling, which is always the way when we want to do some breakouts